Hello, this is the 3.12 video, Fighting on Two Fronts. By the beginning of 1942, the United States was at war. The year ahead would be a difficult one for the Allies. Except for one important victory at Midway, Japan was winning the war in the Pacific. German U-boats were exacting a heavy toll on Allied shipping in the Atlantic. And in Russia, Stalin was pressuring Roosevelt to open a second front against the German army to relieve pressure on the Soviets, who were fighting for their very existence. Through hard work on the home front, strong leadership, and the sacrifices of his fighting men, the Allies persevered and turned the tide against the fascist aggressors who threatened liberty around the world. Goals for this lesson: trace the early military progress of the war in the Pacific, trace the military progress of the war in Europe, and summarize the major events and results of the Holocaust. Lesson resources: grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key, and let's begin. Reading pages 728 through 736. The War in the Pacific. Here's just a look at the picture here quick. American troops captured at Bataan, and we're going to read a little about the Bataan Death March. War in the Pacific. 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers also struck U.S. air bases in the Philippine Islands. Within weeks, Japanese troops landed in the Philippines. They occupied Manila, the capital, without opposition. American and Filipino forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, had moved west to the Bataan Peninsula. After 3 months of fighting, General MacArthur was ordered to a command post in Australia. As he left, he vowed to the troops, "I shall return." In April 1942, Japanese forces took the Bataan Peninsula. About 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners, already hungry and exhausted, were forced to march to a prison camp some 60 miles away. On the Bataan Death March, as it has become known, the Japanese treated their prisoners with brutality. Prisoners were starved and beaten. Those who could not go on were killed with a swift thrust of a bayonet. Now Japanese forces controlled large swaths of Southeast Asia, from the Dutch East Indies to Burma to the Philippines. By early 1942, Japanese military leaders had decided to concentrate on seizing the island of Midway on the theory that they could smash the remaining American naval fleet and then use Midway to launch an invasion of Hawaii. Japanese Admiral Isakuro Yamamoto believed the Midway could be a decisive battle that would enable Japan to dictate a peace agreement. But American intelligence officers had cracked the Japanese naval code and figured out that Japan's navy intended to strike Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered reinforcements to the island, including planes, anti-aircraft guns, and troops. Japanese naval commanders were unaware of the buildup of American forces. During the Japanese attack on the island, American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown spotted Japan's attacking naval fleet and took it by surprise. As they drew near the Japanese ships, the American planes met heavy anti-aircraft fire. About 150 American planes were shot down, but those that made it through pounded Japanese ships with bombs. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were in flames and a 4th later sank. The rest limped away from Midway. The Americans won the Battle of Midway. The battle dramatically demonstrated the impact of air power on the high seas. Admiral Yamamoto's plans to achieve a swift victory over the Americans had vanished. But the war was just half over, and it was going to get much worse. And here's a map, the War in the Pacific, 1941 through 1945. And if you follow the lines, you can see where the big orange line, kind of the circling around, extent of Japanese control in 1942. The little flames there, the little bursts, were major battle sites: Iwo Jima, Midway Islands, Attu, Guadalcanal, Bataan, going on Okinawa, all these major battles. The blue lines represent Allied advances, where they were going forth, starting with Hawaii, going forth from there. There's numbers or dates on there. And then the purple lines are Japanese defense perimeter in August 1945, how their area of control had shrunk down as they got closer to 1945. War in Europe. For the Americans, one crucial challenge was to control the Atlantic Ocean so that men and material could pass safely to Britain. General Dwight D. Eisenhower argued in 1942 that a campaign to control the high seas would be a crucial early battle, and Roosevelt and Churchill seconded his assessment. Nazi U-boats patrolled America's eastern seaboard, sinking ships carrying arms and other critical cargo to the Allied powers of Europe. Lights from America's coastal cities lit the Atlantic's waters, giving the U-boats a kind of lantern that illuminated American freighters, tankers, and destroyers within sight of the American seashore. The U-boat attack was our worst evil, Churchill later reflected, and the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. His fears were well founded. During the first half of 1942, Allied forces on the Atlantic lost 4.7 million tons of cargo to Germany's navy. Over a 2-week period, German submarines sank 35 Allied ships, including tankers carrying precious fuel. While Americans struggled to secure the shipping lanes, Stalin pressured Roosevelt to open a second front against the German army by launching an invasion of Western Europe. Such a front would relieve the pressure on the Russians, who were engaged in a grueling struggle with the Germans in the Eastern Front. Churchill had another idea. In 1942, he urged Roosevelt to put off invading Europe and instead invade North Africa, where British forces were pinned down. Overriding we'll come back to that map. Overriding doubts of his military advisors, FDR went along with Churchill's war plans. General Eisenhower appointed George Patton to undertake the mission in Africa. The Allies mounted a large campaign employing both naval blockades and air power to overwhelm the forces under the command of Axis General Erwin Rommel. Meeting in Casablanca, Morocco, FDR and Churchill pledged to tackle and tame the U-boat menace, use air power to bomb Germany, and launch an invasion of Sicily. FDR declared that his goal was to achieve unconditional surrender from the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Toward the end, the Allies began to win some key battles. In February of 1943, Soviet forces repelled Hitler's army in the Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in human history. The victory ensured the survival of Russia, and put Germany on the defensive. In the struggle to control the Atlantic, the United States began to use escort carriers. From the decks of these small aircraft carriers, planes could take off and then locate and sink German U-boats, which helped to ensure the free flow of supplies and soldiers to beleaguered Britain. After beating back the Axis powers in North Africa, Allied troops crossed the Mediterranean and inched their way to the Italian peninsula. The people of Italy decided they had enough of war. In July 1943, they overthrew Mussolini. The Germans propped him up in a puppet government in the north, but now the defense of Italy was up to the Germans. They made sure that the Allied march up the Italian peninsula was a slow and bloody struggle. Preparing for D-Day. But let's read this first. The Tuskegee Airmen. More than 1 million African Americans served in uniform during World War II. While almost all military units were segregated throughout the war, for the first time blacks had opportunities to become officers and trained for highly skilled positions. One of the most distinguished groups to serve was the Tuskegee Airmen. Do you remember Tuskegee from Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee Institute Vocational Training Center? This is where we get the Tuskegee Airmen. In July 1941, a class of 13 young black men from around the country began aviation training at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. By war's end, nearly 1,000 black pilots had graduated from TAAF and were commissioned as officers. Nearly half of those who earned their wings at TAAF went on to fly combat missions in Europe. They received several presidential citations for the courage and skill they displayed in the fight for North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. They flew more than 200 combat missions before the war was over and lost not one bomber. And there's been movies and books and many other such publications about the Tuskegee Airmen. Okay, this map here, War in Europe, it shows the breakdown of where things were going in Europe, the whole battlefield, and North Africa as well. And then the map inset at the bottom showing the entire Pacific and European theater of war to show you how it truly was a world war. Okay, so where were we? Preparing for D-Day. To coordinate their strategy against Germany, the big three, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. So Churchill is the leader of Great Britain, Roosevelt, the leader of the United States, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. They met at Tehran, Iran from November 28th to December 1st. 1943. At the Tehran Conference, they set a target date for the opening of a second front and the invasion of Western Europe. By January 1944, the Allied High Command focused on launching this all-important invasion from England. They planned to move a huge force of men and machinery across the English Channel and then liberate Western Europe and defeat the Nazis. The man responsible for making the invasion a success was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had commanded the operation that helped defeat German forces in Africa. Ike, as he was known, was a mild-mannered Midwesterner with an extraordinary talent for organizing armies. Now his job was to organize the invasion of the century. There were countless problems to solve and questions to answer. How many men should attack? Which divisions? How many warships and naval vessels? What about tanks? Which planes? How many paratroopers? What kind of landing craft? Where would they invade? One big question Eisenhower faced was where to make the crossing from England. Most people thought the invasion would take place at the French port of Calais, where the English Channel is narrowest. Ike fooled the Germans into thinking an army of 500,000 troops was amassing across the channel from Calais. He even equipped his shadow army with inflatable tanks and fake landing craft and filled the airwaves with the misleading radio messages. Meanwhile, the real invasion force gathered farther west along Britain's coast and prepared to strike the French region of Normandy. The size of the force was enormous. 2 million men, 13,000 planes, 1,500 tanks, and 6,500 sea vessels, including dozens of warships of different sizes and 4,000 custom-designed landing craft. Eisenhower tirelessly encouraged his troops. He visited crews on ships, climbed into the cockpits of warplanes, observed tank maneuvers, and took target practice with the infantry. This operation is being planned as a success, he declared. We cannot afford to fail. By early June 1944, the troops, mostly British, American, and Canadian, were ready to embark. The mighty host was as tense as a coiled spring, Eisenhower later remembered, and indeed that is exactly what it was, a great human spring, coiled for the moment when its energy would be released and would vault the English Channel in the greatest amphibious assault ever attempted. The surprise invasion had a code name, D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the tides and weather were rough, but Eisenhower gave the order, "Okay, let's go." And if you want to see probably one of the best renditions I've come across of the D-Day invasion, if you ever see the movie Saving Private Ryan, the beginning of the movie, they show the D-Day invasion. Of course, it's not real. It's made up. Hollywood, of course, but it's been lauded historically as a good, accurate representation of what it would have been like and the D-Day invasion. So here you see they were on these vessels to take them to close as they could to the coast, and at some point they had to get off and wade through the water and then get to the beach. So that's where we get if you ever heard storming the beaches of Normandy, that's exactly what they were doing there. From D-Day to Paris. Under the cover of darkness, the great Allied Armada started across the English Channel towards 5 Normandy beaches, codenamed Omaha, Utah, Sword, Gold, and Juno. For most of the American troops, this would be their first combat. They were, said one of Ike's officers, as green as growing corn. When the fleet got within range of the French coastline, huge guns aboard the Allied warships began to pound the German defenses, while transport planes dropped paratroopers behind enemy positions. Allied soldiers laden with 60-pound packs clambered from the ships into flat-bottomed landing craft. Seasick and scared, they waited until the landing craft ran close to shore. As steel doors fell downward, the troops jumped into the water. Some struggled and drowned from the sheer weight of their packs, but most pushed as quickly as they could for the beach. Although the Allies took the Germans by surprise, they still met heavy gunfire from the hills beyond the beaches. On Omaha Beach, which the Americans assaulted, 90% of the men in some units were killed or wounded. 90%, that just makes me really emotional. Despite the awful losses, Eisenhower's painstaking preparations began to pay off. More and more landing craft arrived. In 24 hours, some 156,000 troops came ashore in Normandy. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps began rolling up the beaches. By day's end, all 5 landing sites were secured. And here we go. It's just a picture here of the massive undertaking, all the operations there in that picture. In the next 3 weeks, the Allies landed more than 1 million men, nearly 200,000 vehicles, and 600 tons of supplies. Mile by mile, the attacking forces fought their way inland. German troops fought them at every step. The Allies advanced toward Paris. As they converged on the city, Hitler ordered his generals to burn the French capital to the ground. Fortunately, the generals hesitated. On August 25th, Allied troops liberated Paris, and grateful Parisians lined the streets to cheer them on. British, American, French, and Canadian forces now drove east toward the Rhine River, Germany's great natural defense. Meanwhile, Russian troops pressed west towards Germany. And here's a picture, American soldiers at Normandy manning a howitzer. And we'll stop this video here and continue part 2 shortly.